The sound of heavy footsteps echoes across the cobblestone streets of Berlin. The summer sun of 1942 shines on the red swastika flags. The Nazis, triumphant in their European conquests, now look east. In the office of the Wehrmacht High Command, vast maps hang on the wall. The Volga River, a blue ring amidst the endless Russian plains, has now become a sacred goal for the Reich Army. The name of the city on the maps is simple: Stalingrad. But for Hitler, it has a much deeper meaning: the point of defeat or conquest in history. That same day, thousands of kilometers away, in Moscow, Stalin sits at his desk reading reports. The front lines are getting shorter every day. News of the fall of Kharkov, the German advance into the Caucasus, and the threat to Baku oil preoccupies his mind. He knows that a battle is coming that could break the nation's spirit or revive it. In Stalingrad, a densely populated industrial city, factory smoke mingles with summer fog. Women work in steel and armaments factories, while men are sent to the front. Trains roll eastward, laden with weapons, supplies, and hope. But amid the clatter of iron wheels and the blare of locomotive horns, no one knows that in a few weeks, this city will be a living hell. In Europe, German officers speak proudly of the rapid conquest of the East. The Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, is one of the best organized and best equipped forces in the world. Panzer tanks, heavy artillery, and the Luftwaffe Air Force are preparing a meticulous plan to destroy the Soviet Union. The mission seems simple: cross the Don River, advance to the Volga, capture Stalingrad, and cut off the Red Army's supply lines. But no one at the headquarters knows that the plan will turn into a never-ending nightmare. Meanwhile, in the villages around Stalingrad, ordinary people work in the fields. The sky is clear, and the sound of cowbells echoes across the plain. Children play with sticks, women draw water from wells, and men listen to small radios. "Comrades, the enemy is approaching, but we will not retreat," a man's voice from Moscow says. The people's voices fade. All the sound of the wind rustling through the meadows remains. In late June 1942, the great German operation, known as Fall Blau, Operation Blue, begins. Columns of tanks move east from Ukraine and the Donbass. The ground trembles under the steel wheels. The air is full of dust, and the sound of iron and the shouts of soldiers set the rhythm of the new days of war. In the sky, reconnaissance planes map the lines of the Red Army. In the Russian camps, young soldiers line up. Many have just come from military schools, in uniforms that still smell of warehouses. "Stalingrad is the last line. There is no retreat," says the commander. Looks are locked, looks of fear and faith mixed together. In Hitler's office, in Birkengaten, a map lies on a wide table. He points his finger at a spot on the Volga and says, "If we take that, Russia is finished." The officers nod, but no one dares to say that the road to that point goes through hell. It is the hot summer of 1942. The Russian plains are scorched by the sun. Trains full of soldiers and ammunition rush east. At every station, people greet them with flags and flowers, unaware that many of them will never return. There is hope and pride on their faces, a sense of easy victory that will freeze in the cold of the coming winter. At the same time, in the Kremlin, Stalin orders factories to work around the clock. No equipment is to be evacuated from Stalingrad. He wants the city to stand, because his name is engraved on it. He knows that the fall of Stalingrad will be his own symbolic fall. At the end of this section, the documentary mental camera pans over a map of the Soviet Union. From west to east, the flames of battle are burning. To the south, German tanks are advancing toward the Volga. A voiceover in the background says, "The world stood on the brink of a battle not just about soil, but about man's faith and survival." In Stalingrad, history was to be written in blood.
Summer 1942, the beginning of hell on the Russian steppes. The roar of tank engines roared like an iron storm across the endless plains. The hot yellow dust of the steppes danced in the air, and the sun beat down mercilessly on soldiers whose faces were covered in sweat, dust, and fatigue. Nazi Germany was at the height of its power. After the fall of Poland, Norway, France, and the Balkans, it was now the Soviet Union's turn. In Berlin, the maps were spread out, and the commander's fingers were focused on a spot on the Volga River, an industrial, populous, and strategic city called Stalingrad. Stalingrad was not just a city. It was a symbol of the power and pride of the Soviet Union. It was named after Stalin himself, and if the city fell, not only would the Caucasian oil route be open to Germany, but the Soviet spirit would be shattered. In the smoke-filled rooms of the Wehrmacht headquarters, German generals confidently declared, "We are only a few weeks away from victory." In June 1942, the massive Operation Fall Blue began. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks and trucks and supply columns set off eastward. Luftwaffe planes dominated the skies, and there was no sign of effective resistance. On Berlin radio, commentators triumphantly announced, "The Volga will soon flow beneath the boots of the right soldiers." At the front, however, the picture was different. German soldiers advanced in 40 degrees heat during the day and shivered in the dry cold of the steppe at night. Tank chains sank in the soft Russian mud, and supply trucks were left behind. From the sky, endless dust and flies settled on every meal. Russia, with its vastness and violence, was an enemy that seemed as dangerous as the Red Army. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin issued his famous order, "Not a step back." Order number 227. All commanders who ordered a retreat without permission were considered traitors. Behind the defensive lines, NKVD units were deployed to stop anyone who tried to escape. The people knew that this was a war of life and death. By summer, the Germans had reached the Don River, and small towns fell one after another. In the villages, houses burned, fields were destroyed, and peasants fled east. The whistle of trains carrying refugees was lost in the smoke and screams. Russia, with its vastness and violence, was an enemy that seemed as dangerous as the Red Army. In Moscow, a radio announcer said in a trembling but determined voice, "Brothers and sisters, the enemy is coming toward the Volga, but Stalingrad will be the gates of hell for anyone who crosses it." In late August, the Luftwaffe launched its offensive with thousands of sorties. The bombing was so intense that day and night could not be distinguished. Flames danced in the sky, and black smoke rose for kilometers. Within days, Stalingrad had been transformed from an industrial city into a mass of fire and iron. Amid the ruins, people took refuge, women holding their children in their arms, old men praying, and soldiers vowing to hold out until their last breath in amid the rubble. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, wrote in a report to Berlin, "The enemy's resistance is beyond imagination. The city is gone, but the war is not over." On the other side, General Chuikov, commander of the Soviet defenders, set up his command post in the basement of an abandoned factory amid the ruins. Maps hung on the walls, the sound of explosions shook the ground every few minutes. They come from the sky, they advance from the ground, but we rise from the ground. This is the end of the German path, he told his officers. As September approached, the battle reached the gates of Stalingrad. A few kilometers outside the city, Panzer tanks lined up, soldiers awaiting the order to attack. On the Soviet side, new volunteers were arriving from all over the country. Workers, students, even 16-year-olds. On the trains heading to the front, patriotic songs rang out. For the fatherland, for Stalin, for our mothers. The sun was sinking below the horizon on the last day of summer when the first German columns entered the outskirts of the city. Before them were shattered walls, burned-out factories, and streets littered with corpses. But there was no sign of surrender. In every building, in every ruin, in every basement, a group of Soviet soldiers waited. From that moment on, the war broke free from maps and lines on paper and became a house-to-house, hand-to-hand, and breathtaking battle. A battle that changed world history forever. And so, the German march eastward reached the threshold of hell, Stalingrad.
September-October 1942. The city of Stalingrad was no longer a city. Its sky hung thick with smoke. Its streets were filled with crushed bricks, melted iron, and nameless bodies. The sound of bombing did not cease from dawn to dusk. If red flags had once flown over industrial buildings here, now only burnt rags and broken iron beams remained. Amidst this devastation, the German Sixth Army advanced. Panzer tanks rolled through the rubble-strewn streets, but they soon realized that this was no longer an open front. This was urban warfare. Every building, every workshop, every basement had become a death trap. The day the German troops reached the tractor factory, they thought they would crush all resistance in a matter of hours. But behind the thick walls and smoke-filled basements, hundreds of Soviet soldiers were waiting for them. A German officer later wrote, "We fought in a factory where hammering, shouting, and bullets echoed in every corner. The enemy emerged from the pipes, from the roof, from the ground. Even as we killed one, another shadow rose from the dust." General Choikov, the commander of the city's defenders, proclaimed his famous slogan, "Give up no ground without blood." He developed a strategy that later became known as close combat. His soldiers were ordered to stay no more than 50 meters from the enemy, so that the Luftwaffe planes could not bomb them without danger. This tactic turned the battle into a nightmare of close-quarters shooting and knife and spear fighting. On the German side, Commander Paulus and his officers were studying maps in a half-ruined house. The order from Berlin was clear. Stalingrad must be taken, house by house, brick by brick. Hitler saw the city as a symbol of Soviet pride and wanted to crush it into his hands. Berlin radio reported that the Reich's troops would soon raise their flag over the Volga. But in reality, every meter of land had been bought with blood. Along the Volga, small Soviet boats brought troops and supplies into the city from the eastern bank at night. Many of them never reached their destination. German bombing along the river targeted anything moving in the water. But even that did not stop the flood of fresh defenders. Among the Soviet soldiers, names were formed that became legends. One of them was Vasily Zaitsev, a sniper from the Urals who killed more than 200 German soldiers and officers. In the bone-chilling cold and among the silent ruins, he lurked with his old rifle, becoming a symbol of resistance. The Soviets used his story to boost morale. Posters and leaflets were spread across the country that read, "Every bullet you take is your brother's revenge." However, life in the city was a living hell. There was no food except dry bread and a thin soup made from water and potato peelings. The underground hospitals were filled with the screams of the wounded, and the smell of blood, smoke, and disinfectant was overwhelming. Doctors operated without anesthesia. Outside, cats and dogs had disappeared. People were starving, eating whatever they could find. As October approached, the temperature dropped. A cold wind blew from the east, and snow brought the first signs of winter. Soldiers on both sides shivered in the ruins. Their clothes were torn, their hands cracked, and their faces were gray. The German daily reports read, "We no longer see the enemy on the field. He is in the shadows. We hear his voice from under the ground, but we do not know from where he will attack." By mid-October, German forces had captured more than 90% of the city. Only a narrow strip of the Volga River bank was still in Soviet hands. But these few hundred meters were held thanks to Choikov's command. At night, the river was covered with boats bringing in supplies in the darkness. New soldiers emerged silently from the water and immediately joined the battle. At German headquarters,
Paulus was exhausted and anxious. Reports from everywhere said the same thing: the resistance is endless. He appealed to Berlin for help, but Hitler's answer was no. Retreat is forbidden. Stalingrad must be taken at any cost. At any cost. And the cost, for both sides, soon became unimaginable. For as November arrived, the gray skies of Russia turned black, the temperature dropped below zero, and history entered its darkest season. A season in which not only armies, but also hope and humanity froze. On the horizon, over the Volga River, the bells could still be heard from the half-ruined church, but there was no one left to pray.
October, November 1942. There were no more maps. The front lines in Stalingrad were a jumble of streets, alleys, and ruined buildings. No commander could tell which side was German and which Soviet. The only law in the city was survival. Snow and ash were falling from the sky. A cold wind blew off the Volga, carrying the cries of the wounded. The Germans still thought they could take the city, but with every step they took, they fell into another trap. A German sergeant wrote in his notebook, "We are fighting in a city that no longer exists, only half-collapsed walls and shadows moving through the smoke. At night, the enemy comes from the basement. During the day, from the roof. Even the ground betrays us." On the northern side of the city, the battle for a simple 4-story building, a building that later became known in history as Pavlov's house, was fought. A group of Soviet soldiers, led by a young sergeant named Pavlov, managed to capture the building and hold out for 58 days. From the windows and basement, they opened fire on the Germans. Each time the Germans tried to take it, they were torn to pieces in the square opposite. Later, General Trukov said, "They held one house for 60 days, but we held the whole of Stalingrad with the same spirit." In the south of the city, the battle for the #1 train station was also underway. There, control of the building changed hands 3 times in one day. Blood had spilled onto the tracks so much that it had turned the black metal red. One witness wrote, "We no longer knew what we were fighting for. We only knew that if we stood, we would live. If we retreated, we would die." In the basements, the sound of machine guns and explosions mingled with the groans of the wounded. The women who had remained in the city made cartridges and grenades in half-destroyed factories. In a corner of the city, an old teacher wrote in her notebook, "I no longer see my children at school, but the blackboard is still there." It said, "Long live Russia." Now, on that same board, a round of gunpowder sits. The city was divided into 1,000 small battlefields. Each room, each staircase, each ruin was a separate front. When night fell, the sides rested a few meters apart, in silence, waiting to find the other's voice. Sometimes the enemies would mistakenly take shelter next to each other in the darkness, until a small lighter flame was lit and they both understood the truth. Then the silence would break. The air in the city smelled of death. In the cold of November, the frozen bodies in the streets had turned to stone. Dogs gnawed at the corpses, and crows descended from the sky. But amidst all this hell, one thing remained: human will. Soviet soldiers had sworn to stay until their last breath. For them, Stalingrad was not just a city, it was their entire homeland. From the children in the factories to the snipers behind the walls, everyone had one goal: to prevent the enemy from crossing the Volga River. In those days, Commander Paulus wrote in his war diary, "We are close to victory, but closer to death. The city is swallowing us. Every meter of it is stained with the blood of hundreds of people. My soldiers are no longer fighting. They are only alive because they're still breathing." At night, the sky lit up with mortar fire. There was no sound but explosions, screams, and then absolute silence. One cold night, as fresh snow settled on the ruins, a Soviet soldier wrote in his wet notebook, "If I survive tomorrow, I will write again. If not, let this sentence remain. We stand here so that no one forgets how dear freedom is. By the end of November, no one had control of Stalingrad from the sky or the ground. But a few hundred kilometers north of the city, the Red Army was quietly preparing for a counterattack that would shock the world. Its code name, Operation Uranus. And with the cold dawn of November 19, 1942, the sky suddenly split.
November 1942 to January 1943. With the arrival of winter, Stalingrad was no longer just a city, a frozen, bloody mass, its silence broken by explosions and screams. The temperature dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, and every breath was like a knife in the soldiers' lungs. The German soldiers, who had been marching for months across endless plains, were now struggling through frozen streets and burned ruins. Frozen boots, rotten gloves, and thin clothing were no protection against the cold. Tanks were stuck in mud and snow, and supply trucks could no longer deliver ammunition and food. Artillery, the only weapon days before, was now useless in the heavy snow. Every small explosion caused soldiers to slip and fall. On the other side, the Soviet forces were ready. After months of street-to-street resistance, fresh forces were pouring in from the north and west. Operation Uranus, designed to encircle the German Sixth Army, began. Huge columns of tanks and infantry charged across the frozen steppes toward the German lines. General Chuikov shouted, "Don't let a single meter of ground be lost. Today we will surround the enemy, and tomorrow we will bring them to their knees." The German Sixth Army, which had thought itself victorious, was suddenly caught in a huge trap. The soldiers were stuck in the streets, support from the rear was cut off, and the cold was killing hundreds of people every day. Many of them, who had come to the east with pride, were now dying of thirst, hunger, and frostbite. In the basements, the sounds of hunger and the groans of the wounded filled the air. Soviet soldiers, in small boats and through holes in the Volga River, brought in ammunition and food, although it was scarce. A young nurse wrote, "Every day we survive is a miracle. The ground is frozen, the enemy is ahead, but we are still breathing." The battle continued in the streets, factories, and basements. Every building, every room, every corridor was a scene of violence, courage, and sacrifice. Soviet snipers fired from windows, infantrymen lurked in the snow and ice, and every bullet, every explosion told a story of resistance and survival. As January 1943 approached, the German lines collapsed. Supplies were cut off, food and water were frozen, and hope among the German soldiers was fading. General Paulus, now completely surrounded, was forced to surrender and issue an order that no one in Berlin expected. The Sixth Army surrenders. This moment was the turning point of the battle. Stalingrad became not just a city, but a symbol of relentless human resistance. More than 250,000 German and Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Thousands of civilians lost their lives, but the unwavering Soviet resistance and courage changed the course of World War II. Winter still lingered, but as the siege ended, the Volga River witnessed the victorious Soviet troops marching through the snow and smoke. Their shouts of victory, the loudest voice in the silence of Stalingrad. January 1943, end of the battle. The Battle of Stalingrad, after months of violence, ice, fire, and blood, had come to an end. But this end was not simply the fall or victory of an army. It was a story of resistance, sacrifice, terror, and the strength of the human spirit. The city was never the same again. Its streets and buildings were in ruins, and the Volga River was filled with bloody memories.
Military consequences. With the surrender of the German Sixth Army, the Wehrmacht suffered its first major defeat on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad was the turning point of the war. The Soviets were able to seize the initiative and advance westwards. The morale of the German army was severely damaged, and the lines on the Eastern Front were no longer as secure as they had been. Many German commanders, including Pallas, were taken prisoner, and for the first time in modern history, a full-ranking soldier was forced to surrender. Human consequences. Thousands of civilians were killed, many froze or starved to death. But Soviet soldiers, with their incomparable spirit, breathed new life into the nation. Snipers, nurses, volunteers, and ordinary people all understood their role in the battle. One survivor wrote, "In Stalingrad, people were no longer fighting just to survive. They were fighting for memory, for homeland, and for hope." Strategic lessons. The battle showed that even the best armies in the world are vulnerable if they are not properly prepared and local resistance is underestimated. Urban warfare and underground resistance can cripple a well-equipped and prepared army. Human will and national unity, even in the face of advanced equipment and modern tactics, can change the outcome of a war. Real heroes. From the story of sniper Vasily Zaitsev to Sergeant Pavlov and the volunteer nurses, each played a decisive role. They showed that true courage is not only on the battlefield, it also means standing firm, sacrificing, and maintaining hope. Psychological and cultural impact. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad not only changed the war, but also created a legend for generations. The spirit of resistance and the power of reconstruction were later reflected in other major battles, and even in the literature and films of World War II. People around the world understood that even in the darkest circumstances, hope and determination can change the course of history. Conclusion. Stalingrad symbolized the victory of will over equipment, courage over terror, and hope over despair. The battle showed that war, above all else, is a test of the human spirit. And in the end, every square meter of land, every house, every street, and every person left a story of resistance and sacrifice that will remain in history forever.
January-February 1943. Behind all the statistics, the generals, and the victories are the personal stories and unsung heroes that turned the Battle of Stalingrad into a human epic. These were the men and women whose names never made it to the front of books, but whose lives, decisions, and sacrifices changed the course of history. Ordinary soldiers. Ivan Petrov, a 19-year-old infantryman, hid in a ruined factory with only a rifle and rotten boots. He not only managed to stop a column of German tanks, but also carried dozens of wounded soldiers to safety underground. He later wrote, "I never thought that with one hand I would save so many lives, but when the air was full of smoke and fire, there was no choice but to act." Maria Kolesova, a volunteer nurse, sailed small boats down the Volga River, ferrying the wounded and food from one bank to the other. Many remembered her as a shadow, but without her efforts, the lives of hundreds of Soviet soldiers would have ended. Families and civilians. Amid the ruins, families who had survived the bombing built dugouts, collected food, and cared for the wounded. An old teacher wrote on one of the streets, "We can no longer go to school or teach. Our duty is only to keep alive those who still have hope." The unknown snipers, Many snipers were not named or told their stories, but their role was vital. In every shattered window, on every dirt-covered roof, shadows of resistance lurked. They were able to severely restrict enemy movement and change the course of the siege with every bullet. Animal heroes. Among these stories, animals also played a role. Dogs that carried messages and food, horses that delivered ammunition to the front lines, and even cats that guarded the ruins were part of the relentless struggle for survival. One soldier wrote, "I saw a little dog that brought us ammunition every day. He may have been small, but his courage was greater than many men." Stories of personal courage. A German survivor trapped in the siege said years later, "Every day I survived was only thanks to the enemy's human beings who had not destroyed humanity. In the heart of war, we were both human and victim." All these stories show that war is not just a military process. Rather, it is a series of decisions, courage, and human moments that make hope and life possible even in the darkest of circumstances. Section summary. The unsung heroes of Stalingrad, whether soldiers, civilians, or even animals, shaped history. Without their efforts, the siege could not have ended with such intensity and success. These accounts are a reminder that history is not written only by generals and commanders, but also by ordinary people, faced with extraordinarily difficult circumstances.
February 1943 to 1945. With the end of the siege and the surrender of the German Sixth Army, Stalingrad was no longer the city it had been. Ruins covered everything, houses burned, streets filled with dirt and ice, the Volga River filled with the remains of equipment and bodies. But amidst the devastation, people began to rebuild. Rebuilding the city. Locals, surviving soldiers, and volunteers joined forces to clear the rubble. Factory workers resumed producing ammunition and food, and teachers returned to teaching children who had grown up in the midst of the war. Every brick, every stone, and every rebuilt wall was a sign of human will and hope. Human lessons. Stalingrad taught the world that courage and unity, even in the worst of circumstances, can change the outcome. Individual and collective sacrifices, from soldiers to women and children, are vital to the survival of a nation. Urban warfare and underground resistance could halt the advance of even the most advanced armies. Strategic impact. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was a turning point on the Eastern Front. With renewed morale and valuable experience, the Red Army began to advance westward. The Germans were no longer able to regain the initiative, and subsequent defeats, such as Kursk and then the Great Retreats of 1943 and 1944, were directly linked to this victory. Psychological and cultural impact. Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance, will, and hope. Many films, books, and memoirs recounted the battle. Generations learned that even in the darkest of circumstances, people can change history through empathy, courage, and patience. Unforgotten heroes. The stories of snipers, nurses, ordinary soldiers, and families who survived in the ruins still inspire. These heroes showed that war is not just a military battle, it is a battle for humanity, hope, and life. Conclusion. Stalingrad was no longer a battle. It was a great lesson for the world. Lessons of will, courage, sacrifice, and unity that will serve as a reminder for generations that in the face of all darkness, even when hope seems lost, there is always the light of human resistance. January 1943, May 1945. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was not only a military victory,
but also a turning point in the history of World War II. The German army, which had previously made significant advances in the east, suddenly stopped in the middle of the frozen lands of Russia and for the first time experienced defeat and encirclement. The consequences of this battle for other fronts of the war, the strategic decisions of the commanders, and even the political course of the countries involved were profound and far-reaching. Military and strategic impact. With the collapse of the 6th German Army, the Wehrmacht was forced to reconsider the lines of the Eastern Front. Their combat power and equipment were no longer sufficient to advance as before. Soviet forces, trained by the experience of urban resistance and the harsh winter conditions of Stalingrad, were now able to seize the initiative. Subsequent Soviet operations, including the advance towards Kursk and Ukraine, were a direct result of the experiences of the Battle of Stalingrad. German generals who had previously taken victory in the East for granted were now forced to make difficult and sometimes inconclusive strategic decisions to protect their rear and rebuild their army. The combination of manpower, equipment, and morale was too much for any commander to ignore. Psychological and moral impact. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad had a huge psychological impact. In Germany, the public and soldiers lost their morale. The idea of the Wehrmacht's invincibility was shattered, and every subsequent advance was met with skepticism and fear. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, the victory became a national symbol, a sign of the will, courage, and strength of the people and the army united. In London, Washington, and even Paris, military analysts realized that the axis of the German advance was close to failure. Political consequences. The victory at Stalingrad also changed the course of political decisions. In the Soviet Union, Stalin was able to rely on the success of the Eastern Front to put more pressure on the Allies and commanders to coordinate the war. In the Allied countries, confidence in Soviet capabilities increased, and these countries were willing to allocate more resources and support to the Eastern Front. In Germany, Hitler wavered after the defeat at Stalingrad, and his political and military decisions were shaped more by emotions and personal revenge than by realistic calculation. Many historians believe that this was the beginning of the path to the final downfall of the Nazis. Human and cultural impact. Stalingrad not only changed the war, but also shaped the culture and literature of World War II. Thousands of personal stories of courage, sacrifice, and resistance inspired later generations. Soviet snipers, volunteer nurses, ordinary soldiers, and civilians were all part of a human epic that showed that war was not just a battle of equipment, but a test of the spirit and will of men. Movies, memoirs, and books have recounted hundreds of times how even in the worst of circumstances, hope and human will can change the course of history. These narratives taught generations that true courage, sacrifice, and unity, even in the face of apparent defeat, can turn the tide in favor of humanity. Military and strategic lessons. After the war, military analysts cited Stalingrad as an example of the vital lessons of urban and winter warfare. These lessons included the importance of supplies and logistical support even in offensive operations, the impact of troop morale and training on combat effectiveness, the ability of urban resistance and precise ambushes to turn a massive attack around, and the importance of coordination between central command and local units to maintain front cohesion. Effect on the end of the war. Stalingrad marked the beginning of a wave of German defeats in the East. The Soviet advance, the conquest of Ukraine and the Baltics, and the eventual invasion of Poland and Germany all began from this point. Many Allied commanders also focused more confidently on planning joint operations to liberate Europe after this battle. Stalingrad proved that even a single point, if managed with determination and the right plan, could change the course of a major war. Conclusion. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military victory. It was a human, cultural, and political test that showed that will, courage, and sacrifice, even in the darkest of circumstances, could change the outcome of a war. The battle shaped the course of history,
redefined armies, strengthened the morale of nations, and left lessons for generations to come. From the unknown sniper to the supreme commander, everyone played a part in shaping the victory, and their memory will live on forever.
1943, after the end of World War II. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a turning point in human history, the consequences of which were felt for decades, not only in Europe, but also around the world. The battle showed that war is not simply a confrontation of equipment and tactics, but also a test of the spirit, will, and solidarity of human beings. Every street and every ruin in Stalingrad was a testament to sacrifice, courage, and perseverance in the face of the most difficult conditions. Military and strategic legacy. From a military perspective, Stalingrad became a practical manual whose tactics and lessons were studied by armies around the world. After the war, commanders analyzed how urban resistance and winter defense could paralyze the Wehrmacht army and change its course of advance. Subsequent Soviet operations, the advance in Europe, and even Allied strategies in Normandy and other fronts were shaped by the lessons learned from Stalingrad. Stalingrad showed that victory was impossible without unity of forces and logistical support, even with superior equipment and advanced tactics. This was a point that world commanders repeated many times in the following decades. Human and cultural impact. The victory at Stalingrad had a profound effect on the morale of the Soviet people. The stories of the bravery of soldiers, snipers, nurses, and civilians inspired future generations and became a symbol of national resistance and unity. Globally, Stalingrad became a human symbol that even when hope seemed lost, resistance, courage, and empathy could work miracles. Many writers, filmmakers, and historians have recounted in the years since how the unsung snipers, volunteer nurses, and infantrymen, along with strategic planning, were able to change the course of the war. Political and global messages. Politically, the defeat of the German Sixth Army was the beginning of a wave of changes that affected not only the fate of the war in Europe, but also world politics. The Allies gained greater confidence in the Soviet Union's capabilities, and their strategic cooperation in joint attacks on occupied German territories was strengthened. The successive German defeats on the Eastern Front after Stalingrad increased the pressure on Hitler, and his political and military mistakes increased. As a result, Stalingrad was not only a military victory, but also a political turning point that showed that the course of the war could be changed, even when everything seemed in favor of one side. Cultural and educational reflection. Stalingrad became a permanent lesson in world literature, cinema, and military education. From military classes to history schools, the stories there were taught so that future generations would learn that individual courage and sacrifice can change the course of history. Unity and collective cooperation, even among ordinary people, play a vital role in the outcome of a war. Human hope and will are more powerful than any tank, artillery, or plane. Unforgotten heroes. Amid the ruins of Stalingrad, there were thousands of unsung heroes. The simple soldiers who risked their lives without a name or badge. The nurses who cared for the wounded day and night. The families who built shelters in the ruins. And even the animals who carried messages and ammunition were all part of a greater story. These heroes showed that war is not just a battle of commanders and generals, but the relentless efforts of ordinary people that determine the fate of a nation and even the world. Conclusion and global message. Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance, hope, and human will. This battle showed that even in the darkest of circumstances, when everything is against people, courage, sacrifice, and unity can change the course of history. The message of this battle transcends geographical and temporal boundaries, a reminder to all generations that when humanity unites and stands against cruelty and hardship, even the impossible becomes possible. Ultimately,
Stalingrad is not just a military landmark, but a World Heritage Site. A heritage that shows that war is not just a battlefield, but a test of will, humanity, and hope, and that every meter of that frozen ground has left a memory of sacrifice and courage for the world.